I'm absolutely delighted to introduce a friend and colleague from UPenn, the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Troutt Powell, who is a professor of history at UPenn. Really, there's not enough time to do justice to this woman's achievements. So I'm just going to highlight a few things that will at least give us a sense for the kind of work that she does. Professor Powell received her MA, her BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard University. Before settling into the history department at UPenn, she taught for several years at the University of Georgia. As a cultural historian, her research interests have revolved around the history of African slavery in the Nile Valley, for which she's received a number of prestigious fellowships. Among them are fellowships from the American Research Center in Egypt, the Social Science Research Council, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Dr. Powell was also named in 2003 a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, otherwise known as a Genius Grant. Her publications are many, but most notable, at least for our purposes today, are her two books. Her first, published in 2003, entitled A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of Sudan, was seminal, but sort of the groundwork for which, for her second book, which was just newly released a few months ago. That book is entitled Tell This in My Memory, Stories of Enslavement from Egypt, the Sudan, and the Ottoman Empire, and she was just recently featured on Radio Times. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Powell.
Hi, everybody. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but it happens all the time. So, my son is here, and it's just a day. It's just one of those juggling days. So bear with me, please, if I'm a little frazzled. The presentation I'm giving today is called Huda and Halide and the Slaves at Bedtime. And it is part of, this is cheap promotion, it is part of my new book, which is called Tell This in My Memory, and I'm just keeping it close. Anyway, this is a book that explores the different lived experiences of enslavement, both by those who were enslaved and those who actually owned slaves in Egypt, in Sudan, and in the Ottoman Empire. And so I look at a lot of former slaves and their narratives, but I thought it would be, actually I found that I could get some interesting information. I looked at the narratives and the memoirs of important leaders in the Middle East and in Sudan who owned slaves and who wrote about their slaves with different levels of ease, different levels of comfort or intimacy. And two of the most important people are Huda Sha'rawi and her counterpart in the late Ottoman Empire, later the Turkish Republic, Halide Adiblar. So this is who my talk is about today. So my paper begins with a quote from Huda Sha'rawi. This is from her memoirs. I used to imagine that I was not my mother's daughter, that my real mother was a slave girl who had died, and the truth was being withheld from me. Firmly convinced of this, I suffered all the more. I could keep everything suppressed until nightfall, but as soon as I laid my head on the pillow, I was overcome by anxieties and frightening thoughts moved me to tears. My second quote is from Halide Adiblar. The woman whom she calls mother is lying in semi-darkness beside her, in a large bed, clad in her white gown. There are those long, silky plaits which seem to coil with the life of some mysterious coiling animal, and that small, pale face with its unusually long, curly black lashes, resting on the sickly pallor of the drawn cheeks. This mother is a thing of mystery and uneasiness to the little girl. She is afraid of her, she is drawn to her, and yet that thing called affection has not taken shape in her heart. There is only a painful sense of dependence on this mother who is quietly fading out from the background of her life. So, by the time Huda Sha'rawi described how haunted she had been as a child by the idea that her imagined slave mother had died, She was a powerful figure in the Egyptian nationalist movement, a middle-aged woman with her own grown children, and an internationally recognized leader of the women's rights movement in Egypt. Her strong political and nationalist voice made her a figure that for decades dominated articles in the Egyptian press. By the time Halide Adivar wrote down her memories of her sickly mother, whose chronic illnesses left her daughter to be nursed by slave wet nurses, she too was a powerful figure in the Turkish nationalist movement that would eventually and successfully replace the Ottoman government after World War I. When she wrote her memoirs in 1926, Halide was a self-exiled, twice-married mother of three, a best-selling novelist who had been an activist spokesperson for the Young Turk Revolution, a nationalist politician who would eventually become a member of the Turkish parliament. Both women were born into highly privileged families during a period in the late 19th century in which massive political and cultural change would alter the traditions that shaped women's education, marriages, and their public lives. Slaves were an intimate part of their childhoods, and the many vivid experiences that both Halide and Huda remembered about the slaves with whom they had grown up shaped their vision of what maturity and independence should mean for themselves and for the women of their country. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a picture of young Huda, and next to these words of her being haunted by her mother. All right. Huda Sharawi was famous enough by the 1920s. Can you hear me from back here? Yes. Can you hear me over here? Okay, because I realize I do have to poke buttons. All right, better? Now? Now you can hear me. Okay. Huda Sharawi was famous enough by the 1920s that photographs, even caricatures of her image, were published in many newspapers. As Beth Barron has shown, increasingly vocal and politicized Egyptian women leaders struggled with control of their images in the press, and Huda was arguably the most famous and visible of all. Given the sensitivity to slavery that she later revealed in her memoirs, it is interesting to see Huda caricatured in the following way in the popular political magazine El Kashkool. Okay, so I'm sorry. Here is the caricature, and I'm going to leave this up for a while. All right. The cartoon, the what do you call it? The caption I couldn't fit onto the slide. But the cartoon is entitled in Arabic, "Where is Independence?" and refers to a fraught political confrontation over Egypt's nominal independence between Egyptian nationalist politicians and the British. The caption, at the feet of Huda Sharawi on the left, El-Bash'ara begins with his asking her, in colloquial Egyptian Arabic, "My lady, if there is no independence for these men in parliament, what will they do?" Huda answers, "Listen, O Bash'ara, as long as there is a nation that wants independence, don't be afraid. You're more of a man than all of them." The joke here, as El Kashkool's readers would have immediately understood, is that El-Bash'ara is a eunuch who had been a slave in the household in which Huda grew up. Beth Barron points us towards the emasculating irony with which the caricatured Huda states that this eunuch is more of a man than the leading politicians of Egypt's Waft party. But the picture reveals another, perhaps less intentional irony as well. Under the title, "Where is Independence?" stands a remarkably outspoken Egyptian woman with a slave who had been part of her household since childhood, who had, as this chapter will discuss in more depth, helped raise Huda since her babyhood, and stood with her, was satirized along beside her well into her adulthood. Said Aga, as she called him in her memoirs, played a pivotal role in her observations about slavery in Egyptian society, yet remained with her as she matured into a national political figure. We can assume that his role in her life changed after her marriage and the birth of her children, but his connection to her household did not. How does this slave, this life companion, accompany the dramatic trajectory of this groundbreaking woman's life? Could he do so independently? How did this leader of the Egyptian women's movement negotiate the distance between childhood nightmares of a mother's enslavement and the constant, loyal service of a slave her entire life? Now, although by the turn of the century, Egypt and the wider Ottoman Empire were no longer as united politically or economically as they had been a century before, the domestic cultures of the two regions were deeply connected and in massive flux. as they moved up the socioeconomic ladder of opportunities created by the secular schools and institutions of Muhammad Ali, a generation of men with the ambition of Ali Pasha Mubarak. I'm sorry, I'm referring to people in earlier chapters. Okay, let me rephrase that a little bit. As indigenous Egyptians moved up the socioeconomic ladder, okay, as they began to get higher roles of employment in Egyptian society in the middle of the 19th century, men like Huda Sharawi's father, Muhammad Sultan Pasha, often chose to marry Turkish women or to purchase Circassian women as concubines, a practice they shared with their Turkish-speaking elite counterparts in cities like Istanbul. In the late 19th century, when the children of these unions were born, this upper-class Ottoman Egyptian household, and I'm quoting Beth Barron here, one of the most important social formations, unraveled. Harem slavery dwindled dramatically, in part due to the consequences of abolition, but arguably due to more to the rise of nationalism and the powerful idea, again as Beth Barron writes, that foreign-born slave mothers could not be entrusted to raise good patriots. And as Beth Barron continues, the new nation could not be built on households that included harem slaves from the Caucasus, retainers from Central Asia, concubines from Ethiopia, eunuchs from Africa, and patriarchs from Anatolia or the Balkans. The Circassian slaves and their descendants would be absorbed into the new elite, and the new nation would be construed around bourgeois families, Muslim, Coptic, Jewish, grounded in Egyptian territory. The transition from empire to nation-state was reflected on the micro level as large multi-ethnic households were reconstituted as models for the nation. So as men like Muhammad Sultan Pasha, Huda's father, merged with the Ottoman Egyptian elite through marriage and concubinage, Ottoman Egyptians also merged with a changing Egyptian political landscape where leaders spoke eloquently of Egypt for the Egyptians by 1881. So Huda Sharawi was thus not only the daughter of an immensely privileged family, but also a figure who bridged this very transition from the multi-ethnic Ottoman Egyptian household to bourgeois monogamous family structures. Although the politically and historical significance of the transition of the Egyptian family is clearly shown by Beth Barron's careful research and analysis, this transition was difficult, often polarizing, and always deeply felt. Nor was it always cut and dry, as the Kashkul caricature of Huda Sharawi shows. This symbol of the activist and modern Egyptian woman could never quite escape her close connection to slavery. In many ways, this transition also occurred in the late Ottoman Empire, where a growing politicized awareness of Turkish identity also studied very carefully the position of women in marriage and in the family. So Halide, too, like Huda, stood directly on top of this cultural fault line and wrote about it. Both women shared childhoods that were intimately structured by slaves and the rituals of the slave trade. And in this part of the essay, I'm going to skip over this, but I compare them to a Sudanese slave owner who was actually the founder, a nationalist and the founder of the first school for girls in Sudan, a man named Babakar Bedri, who wrote about his slaves all of the time. He was really a fascinating historical figure. They were much wealthier than their Sudanese counterparts, Huda and Halide, but they all grew up in environments where the presence and the work of slaves was as elemental and as comfortable as furniture. The work and presence of slaves helped to define and articulate these elites' sense of home, not only its physical structure, but also the traditions of family structure that bound these servants to them. But it is important to note that, and this is why I want to include Babakar just for a minute, that Huda Sharawi and Halide Adib internalized this relationship with slavery very differently than their male counterparts did. Like him, the trade in slaves punctuated the women's lives, but unlike Babakar, they were connected to an even broader network of slaves than that available to him. Within the system in Sudan, all slaves came from other parts of Sudan or Ethiopia. In Sudan, the system enabled a man like Babakar to take pride repeatedly in his memoirs that none of his ancestors were slaves. And those ancestors he counted were patriarchs of the family. Of course, there were slaves in the family, but his genealogy came from his fathers and his father's fathers and his father's father's fathers, etc. This was not the case for Huda Sharawi, whose household as a child was made up of slaves and servants from Sudan and the Caucasus, and whose own mother came from a group of people intimately connected with Circassian slavery. Nor was it similar to Halide's upbringing, and as we shall see, her constant vigilance against being told that she looked like a slave or that her personality came from blood ties to slaves. So Huda's memoirs are a fascinating account of her struggle against the constraints of her childhood and her protest against the premises upon which the Egyptian upper-class households were both structured and idealized in the late 19th century. She was a careful observer of her society and acutely aware of the limitations facing Egyptian and Ottoman women. She followed closely debates about the status of women in Egyptian society and in turn-of-the-century Egypt. This debate often equated the circumstances of women with those of slaves. So let me move on to look at her famous unfinished memoir, Mudakirati, which came out after her death. All right, was dictated to her secretary in French with Halide's memoirs for what they heard about or from the slaves in her father's house. So I will be exploring that. And here are the questions that I would like to ask. Huda and Halide were but two among well-known men and women writing about their personal experiences in the harem and with slaves. Their relations to the slaves of her household, most of whom they remembered with tenderness, exemplify the close personal ties and the intimacy with which many Egyptians and Ottomans of their age viewed those who served them. What is important here, and what I hope you will be listening for in the telling of their stories, is whether or not they really could hear the voices of their slaves. Could these slaves move in their imaginations with Huda and Halide into adulthood, and not only into their master's maturity, but mature into their own identity? Could they make the transition with these women into maturity and modernity? Okay. Good so far? I mean, you're all with me? No one's asleep? Kids up? Okay, good. All right. Was my real mother a slave? As we have seen above, Huda was haunted by the fantasy that she was not the daughter of the mother she knew, but of a slave girl who had died. What circumstances could have frightened this privileged little girl into such a sad dream? In 1879, Huda was born into the wealthiest strata of Egyptian society, and consequently into a social network in which Circassian slave women were often concubines, wives, and mothers to very affluent children. These parts of Egyptian society were intimately connected to the elites of Ottoman society, as I have already explained, and so I will move on. Now, a generation before Huda's birth, all right, actually her mother, thousands of young women, the age of Huda's mother, were brought from the regions of the Caucasus. All right, and here is a picture from Harper's Weekly. This is from 1876, okay? They were brought from the Caucasus to the largest cities of the Ottoman Empire as slaves to be sold. If these young women were fortunate enough to be sold to wealthy families, they stood the chance to be educated and well-maintained. If they bore children to their master's husbands, their position was enhanced legally, and they can be manumitted and gain rights towards inheritance. Their lives in the harem part of the household, the rooms in the homes where they were segregated from unrelated men, intrigued Western travelers and readers in the 19th century, who romanticized the daily lives of these white Circassian women much more than they did the drudgery of African slaves working often in the same chambers. But often there was little romance to the challenges faced by these women in a time when they could exert very little control over their sexual or reproductive lives. And I go on in this part to explore a very famous article by the historian Ehud Toledano that he had one of these aha moments in the Egyptian archives where he discovered in the police records the story of a young slave woman named Shemsigul, a Circassian slave woman, whose baby was taken from her after the owners tried to botch the abortion, and she was impregnated by the man who purchased her, and then he sold her, but he didn't say that she was pregnant, and so it got into this big legal mess, and in the end she lost her baby, and she sued to get her baby back, and we don't know what happened, but it's a very famous story, and one that has become kind of archetypal because we can find so few others exactly like it for the experience of young slave women. Okay, So her story, this woman Shamsi Gul, brings home much more clearly how much of maternity was lost to the rules of enslavement, and the tragedy of seeing her baby seized emerges in her narrative as clearly as in the narratives of slaves torn from their natal origins in other of the narratives that I looked for. A child at the time that Shamsi Gul told her story to the police in Cairo, Hoda Sharawi's mother, Iqbal, would have understood this depressive and these sad circumstances. In fact, as Hoda wrote, her mother confronted sorrow and depression through much of her adult life. Although her pregnancies were not disrupted like Shamsi Gul's, she too was forced to make a difficult and traumatizing trek from the Caucasus to Egypt during her adolescence. The decade between 1854 and 1866 marked a period of political terror and economic disaster for many of the ethnic groups of the Caucasus, where Iqbal was born. This vastly multi-ethnic region had long been, as we know, a major provider of slaves for the Ottoman Empire. And as Lyubov Dulugian writes, the Caucasus was the most renowned source of male and female slaves employed for concubinage and sexual services. Hoda Sharawi's mother came from a politically important family in the Caucasus, and so would undoubtedly have been familiar with a world in which economically slaves were also a universal measure of exchange. This was a system in which there were different kinds of slaves, those who were kept in the household, who eventually achieved a form of belonging and acceptance in the family, and those who had virtually no status or identity were probably prisoners of war and were strangers to the family and the society of the enslaving family. Hoda's mother may have been aware as a young child of the raids that many nobles of the Caucasus launched against each other, with devastating results for many villages. Certainly, she was an eyewitness as well to the more serious wars that broke out between ethnic groups in the region towards the middle of the 1850s. During this period, Russia began to exert more control over the region, sometimes as a force of abolition and often as an expansionist empire. Torn between affinities with the Ottoman Empire and the promises of political strength extended by Russia, the nobility of the Caucasus found itself under increasing political and economic pressure until some broke out in a full-fledged rebellion against Russian attempts to solidify its control. Hoda's grandfather, the father of her mother, was a leader in these revolts. As the details she painstakingly included in her memoirs show, it was important to Hoda to understand her mother's origins and how her mother began her life in the Caucasus yet ended up in Egypt. What we know of Iqbal's journey came to Hoda from her maternal uncle Yusuf, who told her of the war that erupted between Russia and the Caucasus in 1860, in which he and his sister's grandfather, Hoda's great-grandfather, fought against the Russians but lost his regiment and were taken prisoner. The grandfather's nemesis, the more famous anti-Russian rebel Sheikh Shamil, spread rumors that the grandfather had joined the Russian side. Local pro-Shamil authorities then took 16-year-old Yusuf prisoner, holding him as a hostage for ransom and threatening him with execution if he did not deliver his own father to them. The family, however, gathered armed allies who freed the boy. Okay, and after this, the family became victim to a great deal of political intrigue and violent intrigue and military stuff. The continued turmoil was destroying the family, and Hoda's grandmother, Yusuf's mother, fled the Caucasus with her 5 children, following thousands of other emigres on well-worn paths to Istanbul. Hungry and anxious, they waited at the border for months as the overwhelmed Ottoman authorities sorted out their status and took their property and money, according to Uncle Yusuf. During the long wait, the 2 youngest children died of sickness, and Hoda's grandmother, fearing for the life of her remaining daughter, arranged to send Iqbal to Egypt to live with her uncle. The family entrusted Iqbal's delivery to her uncle to a friend also on his way to Egypt, but when the pair arrived in Cairo, they discovered that the uncle was in Sudan fighting against this new Islamic rebellion of the Mahdiya, and the uncle's wife refused to claim any connection to this Circassian refugee. Let me just slow down there and just hope you all followed this terrible, my sentences are rambling, but so was Iqbal, okay, moving and just what this journey, this little passage of her life represented and the confusion it brought about to the family. So Iqbal, a beautiful, young, and unmarried woman, was placed in the household of another elite officer to wait for her uncle's arrival.
Here her situation soon became very difficult. Her position, it was felt, made her too competitive for the attention of men, and as Huda writes, it was a good fortune that my father chose her to be his wife. There is to the record right now, it might come up, it might be found, right now there is actually no proof that Muhammad Sultan Pasha, Huda's father, married Iqbal. And most historians of Huda's life consider Iqbal to have been his concubine, a status that often meant that the woman had been purchased. Huda's memoirs contain many details about the difficult passage of her Circassian relatives from the Caucasus, but none about the possibility that her own mother had been sold to her father in Cairo. Instead, she paints a picture of a husband doting on his melancholy wife, and I hope you will bear with me for this quote from her memoirs. One day, Iqbal, was helping my father put on his clothes, and it just so happened that she was standing by the window, looking out in the park, and she began to weep. My father asked her what caused her to cry. She responded that among the visitors waiting in the reception room, there was one who resembled her brother Yusuf, and she couldn't keep herself from crying. Huda's father asked her about her family and kinsfolk. When she told him her story, he went straight away to the household of Ali Bey Ragab, where Iqbal had stayed upon first arriving in Cairo, to get the address of her family. And fortunately, there were relatives present in Egypt. My father prepared the funds to send for the family. He brought them. The meeting was great joy and deeply affected my mother, who moved into the first house in his compound. So Huda's uncle Yusuf and other relatives soon followed. And Huda writes, and my mother returned again to her family and to her relations. So a lovely reunion, but there's a great deal that's symbolized, and perhaps we can read between the lines to understand what is revealed in this reunion and what is a little extra legal that comes out as well. Huda's narrative here reveals several possibilities about her mother's status in the Sultan household. Had she been Muhammad Sultan's social or economic equal with a strong family of her own in Egypt, the details of her family and her relatives would have been made well known to him during the negotiations for marriage. He does not discover these details until she has become a member of his house, intimate enough to help him with his clothes, but not with a strong enough standing to deserve her own rooms in the compound as a wife of greater standing would have. And Huda's father did have a wife, known lovingly to Huda as el-Kabira, or the first wife, who did have her own apartments. And we see after this reunion, Iqbal does get her own apartment, but you see she was not there at that level beforehand. But once Sultan Pasha learned of Iqbal's forced separation from her family, and the story is proven true, she does rise in status. Certainly in the memory of her little girl Huda, already worried by the fear that her mother had been a slave, Iqbal succeeded in erasing any traces of slavery or concubinage. Perhaps this work of erasure helped assuage Huda's bad dreams about slavery, and perhaps these evasive silences protected the social position of Huda's children. Gives me time to move on. Okay. So I'm going to move through. I talk a bit more about the slave trade in the Caucasus, but I'm going to move on now just to give you one or two passages about Said Aga, all right, who we saw in the caricature. All right, we saw a caricature. We didn't really see him. Okay. Now, I'm turning to Sudanese slavery. International pressure caused the trade in African slaves in the Ottoman Empire, and particularly in Egypt, to be made illegal in 1874. Slavery itself, however, was not outlawed, and African slaves to continue to make up a significant part of the domestic labor force, particularly in wealthy homes like Huda Shahrawi's. In her remembrances of her childhood, Said Aga, an intimate guardian, figures quite prominently. There are other Sudanese slaves as well who wander through her past life. Almost all of them disappear as her memoirs go into her adult life. Only a passing reference to Said Aga lets her readers know that he accompanied her into adulthood. The saddest and most pivotal lessons that Huda learned from her childhood was about the inequality of status between boys and girls in Egyptian society. This was literally brought home to her in the disparity of treatment that she and her brother received when each of them was sick. While her father, long dead, and her brother, much loved, are never represented as discriminating against her, it is the women and the dependents of the house who Hoda cites as being unequal in their love and in their treatment of her. Mama el-Kabira, her father's first wife, explained this to her. I remember I asked her one day, she writes, to explain to me why my brother was preferred over me. She replied with her sweet smile, do you not feel or understand now the difference between you and him? And I said, yes, but I'm the elder. I came first. My share should be larger than his, and my place above his. And she said, but you're a girl, and he's a boy. And not only that, but you're not the only girl, and he is the only boy, whose responsibility it will be to perpetuate the family name. Now, as Leila Ahmed describes in her account of this moment in Hoda's development, this response briefly assuages the child's anguish over the matter, and she finds herself comprehending now that her brother will keep alive her beloved father's name, loving the brother all the more for it. But although she also loves Said Aga, she memorializes her fury at him for his own collusion in the preferential treatment of her brother. Only a page after Mama el-Kabira explains the rules of gender, Hoda described how much refuge she took in studying. She and her brother took lessons in French, Arabic, and Turkish, and Hoda found herself particularly enthralled by Arabic. Said Aga supervised every lesson. He was the master, she says, and the last word over all of the servants and our tutors. Hoda was frustrated by her inability to read the Quran correctly and was informed, I'm sorry, a little boy just distracted me, and was informed by her teacher that this was because she was not studying Arabic grammar. Hoda was excited to learn the rules of grammar, and her tutor agreed and brought the correct books the next day. Said Aga asked him, with arrogance and haughtiness, be'uzma wa kibriya, okay, what are those books? The tutor responded, grammar books. And as Hoda remembered the scene, the Aga chuckled and then said to the tutor, take your books. There is no need for them because she is never going to be a lawyer. If any of you have read Harem Years by Hoda Sharawi, and if any of you have ever heard any discussion of Hoda Sharawi, this is always the scene that is a pivotal part of her life. This man cutting her off from the glories of Arabic grammar. And as she writes, this incident affected me very deeply. Despair penetrated my heart, and bitterness seized me to the point where I neglected my studies. I began to hate my femininity because it deprived me of the joys of studying or engaging in the sports that I love so much, just like it would impede the freedom for which I so yearned. So Said Aga becomes, in this much-quoted page from Hoda's very famous life, the embodiment of authority that kept women inferior and unfulfilled in Egyptian society. It seemed to Hoda that he ruled over everything. If Hoda and her brother committed any infraction, their nurses would complain to Said Aga, and he would make the siblings go into the yard, get branches from a tree, and bring them back so that he could beat their palms of their hands and leave them crying. But then, Hoda wrote, he would take the handkerchiefs out of our pockets and wipe away our tears. And then he would say, you have each made restitution, but beware of what you did again. Beware of what you did. Don't do it again. If you do, the punishment will be worse. And then, she writes, he would become a child like us. Said Aga played with them, ran with them, and chased them. Hoda would forget his severity in the face of his playfulness, but her brother could not. As Hoda remembered, her brother would return to the house after such a disciplining, and he would climb up the stairs and hurry to my mother to tell her the news, complaining to her, while overwhelmed with tears, what the Aga had done, saying, that slave hit me. In Arabic, it would be darabni hadal abid. So he uses the term that was common usage for not a concubine like Iqbal, but for a darker-skinned slave from Sudan. Said Aga would explain to the mother why the children had deserved this punishment, and she would calm her son down, explaining, he is your guardian, and he only does it to keep you safe. It took Hoda a while to understand the constraints of Said Aga's life and the limits of his authority, but she remembered that her mother felt a very special sympathy for him, which she tried to explain to her children. Said Aga was very proud to serve in the Sharawi household, and Iqbal understood the source of this pride. It was not only because this was an important and wealthy family, but also because Muhammad Sultan Pasha had bought him when he was very small, had taken care of his upbringing, especially in having him educated in school. I'm sorry. Of course, the mic works perfectly on that. So she says, Lala Said, and Lala is another term for these chief servants. Lala Saeed was proud and disdainful, haughty in his behavior, and very proud to belong to our household. My mother was tender and sympathetic towards him because my father had brought him so early and had concerned himself with his upbringing and his education in school. He loved my father to the point of worship. When he grew up, he directed that love towards us. When my mother appreciated this love for my father and for us later, I also appreciated him and recognized the benefit of his raising us. It had a tremendous influence on me. Hoda also appreciated how well run the household was under Said Aga's watch. She recognized a rhythm of efficiency and loyalty and described the household laborers in terms that were often idyllic. Moja Kaf has taken a particularly careful look at this remembered scene. So this is Hoda writing. This is Moja Kaf's translation of Hoda writing. I recall, for example, our grand house with its spacious apartments and vast parlor, how it used to teem with slave girls and bondsmen. That's Kaf's translation. They were well trained to work, sincere in performing their duties, sensitive to the responsibilities placed on their shoulders, respectful of their employers, careful with the things in their hands, and loving towards the children of their employers who were born in their hands. Each one would rise to his task in the best manner and would accompany us for better or for worse, and would never reach his hand toward anything, no matter how costly, and would not covet a single thing but the pleasures of those who had authority over him. And we reciprocated this love with them and appreciated in them this loyalty. Okay. What is interesting is that Hoda voiced how much she missed this economic order. And I quote her, especially when I am confronted with some of the modern customs, which make me long to return to the past and all of it that it contains of customs and manners. Okay. So at this point in my research, I have found no details about the date of Said Aga's death and whether or not he predeceased Hoda, who died in 1947. And therefore I do not know whether he was still in her household when she dictated this nostalgia for the customs of the past to her secretary. We may be able to assume from the El Kashkul caricature that I showed you, that was from 1936. So we may be able to conclude that he was still in her employ then. His presence is most detailed and vivid in the first volume of her memoirs, in which she described her coming of age. But even though his presence is less clear the further she moves into her adult and then her public political life in her memoirs, he stayed with her well into her adulthood, guiding her through her marriage and representing a close, dependable link to the days of her past. I'm not going to go into descriptions of how he helped talk her into a marriage she did not want. Okay, I won't do that. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move to just one short scene before I get to Halide and then the conclusion of my paper. So let me move here. In Hoda's memoirs, we hear Said Aga speak in only two tones, arrogantly giving orders to the children or servants in the household or to social inferiors outside of the house, or gently urging Hoda to accept her fate and accept the social rules that govern her marriage contract. Somehow, Iqbal, Hoda's mother, knows that he had been sold to the family when very young, and for this she shares a deep empathy with him. But this most prominent slave is never recorded offering any detail of himself or of his past life. Interestingly, however, female slaves speak much more freely of their past. The governesses, the maids, and the wet nurses who took care of Hoda and her brother had been with the family since before the children's birth and knew the history of all the household's members. In a beautifully described tableau, Hoda relates tender evenings of storytelling, and I quote, "As for our night times, we used to spend most of them sitting in little groups around a large lantern because electricity was not yet widely spread in Cairo. Our wet nurses would tell us their stories, how they were enslaved, what their countries of origin had been like, what the customs of their people were like until we grew sleepy and they would carry us to our beds." So Hoda and her brother knew then that these slaves were not indigenous to Egypt, but they had been there so long, had been in the household for so long, that the pain of separation from their own families and the memories of their own childhoods had become candlelit stories, told and remembered like lullaby folk tales. The voices of these slaves in Hoda's childhood homes are just whispers, intended to put her to sleep, and not meant, it seems, to be remembered as important stories in and of themselves. These stories were not part of the family lore. The bonds that tied the slaves to Hoda were indeed intimate, but they had been forced. They were not stories that imparted a shared cultural past. And while I marvel at the very human desire of the Sudanese slaves to voice their stories while putting little Hoda to bed, I do not read Hoda as attributing meaning to their narratives. As Moja Kaf sees in this reticence of Hoda's almost a competitive censoring of the slaves. And she writes, Hoda subordinates that potential discursive plurality to her unified voice by evading their direct discourse and keeping their characters half acknowledged in the margins of the story. She does not, for example, allow the recital of the servants' nightly life stories, with which they fascinated the children, to enter the narrative as direct discourse, although her own manner of storytelling, particularly her thrilling manner with dramatic incidents, surely owes much to the servants. She repeats only fragments of the servant's speech that its charm cannot attract the reader, enough that the wet nurse's sentences are still ringing in her ear. I think this is right. Hoda did learn to tell stories from the narrative gifts given to her by her servants. She admits this when she describes how Sit al-Zahra, the woman who sold rose water and perfume to the house, entertained them. And bear with me, this is Hoda again. She was tall, with a wide body and a round face with dignified features. She always wore white clothes and on her head a white scarf. We loved her a great deal and looked forward to her visits, waiting eagerly to hear her entertaining stories. Because of how much we loved her, we encouraged her to stay as late as possible. We would spend the evening listening while she told in her golden voice her delightful stories. We sat around her, all of our eyes wide and ears open. She went from story to story, and the salon on those evenings was filled with the entire household, who formed a large circle that overflowed out of the door. Afterwards, we'd fall into bed dreaming the stories that she told, entering the world of imagination. I think now it's because of this gifted woman that our imaginations had life. So again, Hoda does not directly share those tales with her readers, but instead the sense of intoxication that the tales induced. Sit al-Zahra may have been a former slave or a servant. She certainly was a peddler at this time. But with the slaves who put Hoda to bed as a child, she taught Hoda how to tell stories, or more honestly, how to tell her own story. Hoda's memories of the slaves' voices set the stage of her own repressed childhood, a truly important story, but one in which the others' narratives are only a background. All right, if you are all still with me, can I keep going for a little bit? Okay. Now I want to introduce you more closely as I wrap this up to Halide Adivar. Okay, so as I mentioned, Halide also grew up in a household with a male servant who was a eunuch, and her presentation of him and what he meant to her shows the strong similarities that she shared with Hoda. Sometimes in these memoirs, which were written in English in 1926, Halide described her younger self in the third person, as noticeable in this passage where the servant's body forms the boundaries of her life. Ali is the manservant who takes care of her. He is her Lala, and this little part is from this, that indispensable personage in every old Turkish household from which no English, no European equivalent can exist, for it arose from roots wholly foreign to them, wholly Oriental. The Lala was the natural outcome of the marked separation between the indoor and outdoor life of that day and world. Indoors was the delicate, intimate world of women. Indoors was the delicate, intimate rule of women. Out of doors was the realm of men. They could play there their proper role of protector, and one felt happy and secure in their presence. As a child, and as a child only, one could share to the full the freedom of the two worlds, and one's Lala was one's natural companion into all the open-air places of experience. Then, too, he brings with him into memory that je ne sais quoi of the old world service, devotion, attachment, pride, possession even, which the modern Turkish world has forgotten, but which made so much of the warmth and color of the old household life. So here, too, is that mourning for the past's courtesies based on old patterns of domestic labor. Halide would have understood Hoda so well, and why she would have seen as natural Said Aga's place in Hoda's adult life. Like Hoda Sharawi, Halide remembered as a child fearing that she too was somehow related to slaves, although she does not perform the same obfuscation with her mother's past as Hoda does. But one could inherit a taint of slave status not only through direct parentage, as Halide describes here. So these are Halide's own words. The accusation of having gypsy milk and mixed milk was a common one in those days. As my mother had been too delicate, father had hired wet nurses for me. It was believed that the milk a baby drinks affects its character, making it like the woman who nurses it. My first milk mother, as we call a foster mother, was an Albanian, and my sullen moods were put down to her. Granny would say, "Now it is the milk of that crossed Albanian which is working in you." The next was the wife of an onion seller, a supposed gypsy. Hence, anything in me different from a conventional Turkish child was her fault. For 3 months, fortunately, a good and beloved person had nursed me, and this gave the explanation of certain good traits. Whenever I was docile, gentle, or unselfish, it was attributed to my Nevres Badger. Badger is the appellation of a Negro nurse. That is Halide's parentheses. A black slave to my granny's who had married in Istanbul. In spite of her black face, she had a milk-white heart and had really lovely manners. She had a respected position, and Granny visited her often and allowed her to take us, one at a time, to her house for long visits during Ramadan. This holy month was a wonderful time in those days. So as Halide remembers it, she was not the only one for whom slave was an insult and epithet. She had unruly hair, although here it's combed back, and a visitor to the house teased her about it, but she refused to laugh. When the man saw that he could not tease me about my hair, he called me a little slave girl and swore that he had actually seen me bought from a slave dealer and actually knew the price that was paid for me, although he kept a mysterious silence on this point. Taking a step back from her childhood, Halide contextualizes the situation and wrote, "This was the identical nonsense with which every little girl was teased in Turkey in those days. Yet every little girl minded it terribly, and some stupid ones, like me, almost believed it." So this memory, shared with all the former little Turkish girls of a certain age and class, offers a profound insight into the ways in which enslavement entered the lexicon of gender and mothering. The insult here is about value. He actually knew the price that was paid for me, although he kept a mysterious silence on this point. And that Halide did not consider it ridiculous, although her adult narrating self wishes that she had, speaks to the power of this epithet. And in the next memory, Halide literally has to work her way through a sense of threat and terror when an elite eunuch of one-time slave status has some fun with her. I don't think I have, no, I don't. There in father's room, in front of his writing table and sitting in his chair, was a eunuch. As these people were familiar sights in the palace, the circumstance was not in itself strange, but this eunuch was different from the stately black men I was accustomed to. His face was a light milk and coffee color. His features were more regular than my own. His eyes were big and of the troubling kind, sad, humorous, and very beautiful. His large, handsome head was set on a crippled body with an enormous hunch in the back. I began walking around him in order to get a good view of the hunch, and then I stood and stared at him fascinated. I believe there was the curve of a smile. In fact, there were many smile curves in the corners of his mouth, but he kept them under control and returned my gaze seriously for a time. And then he sighed and rolled his eyes, his face taking on an extraordinary look of real suffering. "Ah, I'm waiting for my father." "Who is your father?" "My father?" He looked astonished. "My father is Adib Bey, of course." And Halide says, "He's my father." "Well, I'm talking of Adib Bey too, but he is my father. At least he was. I was his son, his firstborn, and you, a black foundling from the streets, came and bewitched both of us. I became crippled and black, and you white, and took my place, and I was turned into the street." His face crumbled into lines, his voice sobbed, his eyes became full of tears, yet watched me furtively. I have never been torn between so many different sensations: belief in my own wicked witchery, fear lest I might be found out and sent again to the streets and become a negress once more, pity for his miserable fate, and hatred towards him for making me feel all of this. I was trying hard to swallow the painful lump in my throat, to hold back the tears that already stood on my lashes. I needed the strength of a dozen buffaloes to keep my mouth from trembling in ever so many directions. He crawled toward me, gazed at me, and tried to kiss me. "You little dear black witch," he said as father entered the room. "What tricks are you playing on my little girl, Aga?" he said. "Telling her not to steal of fathers of such poor orphans as I," he answered. Father laughed and took me on his knees, but did not trouble to explain what seemed a tragic dilemma to me. I carried a misgiving in my heart about this until its absurdity gradually made itself apparent to me. So racial identity is horrifyingly fluid to this little girl Halide, and the possibility of not being her father's white child terrifying to her. It is also interesting to see how this joke unites Adib Bey, Halide's father, and the Aga, clearly someone close to him, but never really identified. It makes both of them laugh. It is clear, too, though, that Halide gave a lot of thought to constructions of race in her childhood when writing as an adult, in ways that were never imagined by Huda Sharawi. And I think it's important to tell you all that she was exiled. She exiled herself and got a job teaching at Columbia University, and she lived in Harlem while she was writing these. And so she's living in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, all right? So it's interesting to see what kind of lexicography of race she was able to glean from the worthies around her, in Upper Manhattan. Very different from where Huda was getting her sense. Okay, so in her memoirs, Huda Sharawi shared the closeness of slaves in her life without sharing their stories. And Halide also expressed in a different way that the stories of slaves were not terribly interesting to her. But I'm going to, with this end, actually, I just have to do it. Okay, so as she does here when she describes a servant, Fikriyar, being happy to have someone to talk to. She started each time from the very beginning, telling me about her childhood, the Caucasus, the great emigration, the settlement at Adabazar, and how the chief of her clan sold her in Constantinople to an Egyptian palace. Her adventures I hardly listened to, but she always ended up with the Circassian youth, my father's protege. But even if this slave, Fikriyar, did little to excite Halide's imagination, the experience of other slaves did. She represented slaves as not only companions, servants, and nurses, but also having been bought for her. There was no secrecy about their purchase. In fact, Halide documents what it felt like to receive a new slave from her perspective and that of the slave when she and her big sister received 2 Abyssinian girls bought in Yemen as gifts. As Halide described, the little girl brought for her sister was not an interesting creature, but Reshe, the one brought for me, was as pretty as an Abyssinian girl could be. And this is what she writes. As a rule, I believe colored people have sad dispositions, but when they arrive in a foreign country as slaves, hardly speaking a word of its language, they must feel sad indeed. Granny used to say that Turkish chickens and the Abyssinian children are the most delicate creatures in the world, and I thought of it as I saw Reshe blinking at us and looking around with what seemed more like fear than curiosity. Halide remembered very clearly Reshe's first night in the household and the image of her little sister Niloufer and Reshe staring at each other. Niloufer was frightened that Reshe would eat her. Are you sure she's not a cannibal? We were told a great many stories of cannibals, and their characteristics, according to our information, were 2 canine teeth sharper than other people's, and a tail. Halide looked over at Reshe, who smiled strangely. Halide remembered it as more of a grimace than a smile. Still, she reassured her little sister that Reshe was not a cannibal. Years later, Halide remembered, when Reshe learned Turkish well enough to talk, it was most amusing to hear her impressions of that first night in my room. Reshe had heard in Yemen that the white people of Constantinople were in the habit of eating Abyssinians. So Halide also remembered Reshe's beautiful dancing and the song she would sing when she was happy and the song she would sing when she was sad. Halide loved it. I never learned what this wonderful song meant, for by the time she learned Turkish, she had forgotten her own Abyssinian, writes Halide. But it had infinite pathos and longing. From it, I caught a glimpse of the misery of her past days before she was able to tell me about the way she had been stolen with her little brother from a wonderful Abyssinian forest and made to walk for months under the lash of slave dealers. There was that in her song, especially in the way that she sang it, which made one guess the dreary suffering through the meaningless words. Whenever the oppression and weariness of life settled on my heart too heavily, I used to ask her to come to my room and sing me that song. Though we cannot hear the song, Halide hums a little of Reshe's story. Then Halide borrows the melody and the singer to help express her own feelings. In somewhat of a conclusion to this story, Halide promised Reshe she would grant her heart's desire, which was to dress exactly as Halide did. And you can see Halide dressed very nicely. Halide promised her, and I quote, that when I was grown up and married and had a house of my own, I would see that she should have the same dresses as I did, as well as a servant and a nice room to herself. At the same time, I wrote her a liberating paper, worded exactly as Granny had told me she had written the liberating papers of her slaves, so that Reshe no longer technically belonged to me. I gave her this paper and told her to keep it in order to ensure her freedom in case I died or when anyone else tried to sell her as if she was still a slave. So although now free, Reshe remained in the household with Halide, and when Halide married, Reshe moved with her into her new home. As a young married woman with babies of her own, Halide observed that Reshe, I quote, had developed into a fine colored lady, dressed in the latest fashion, proud of the attention she attracted, and always taking care to wear a thick veil and gloves, which caused her to be taken for a white woman with a beautiful figure. They grew into women together, and Halide kept her promise about the clothes. One wonders what Huda would have thought. Even more, one wonders what Sayyid Aga would have thought. Thank you.
Wonderful. Floor is open. We have a few minutes for questions. So, something happened. Dr. Kate.
I love it.
I'm sorry?
I love it.
Oh.
And I'm the approach I'm taking. I'm thinking about the question of diaspora study, and in that relationship, this notion of these Africans in Turkish space, which we don't talk about much. So it becomes an interesting subject in that regard.
Actually, the rest of this chapter, there's more, but I could keep going, but the rest of this chapter talks about this new movement, and I'm sure you've heard of it, of the Afro-Turks. And there's this book by a man named Troutt, which in French is called Biographie d'une famille d'esclaves. And it's all about tracing his ancestry from his great-grandparents who had been Ottoman slaves. And they're finally able to do that, and how these Afro-Turks are asserting their identity. First in France through their diaspora, but then back into Turkey because they are not giving up their Turkish identity. They're including and it's really fascinating. Yeah. Do you see the diaspora in East Africa too?
Oh yes. I mean that's one of the big critiques about African diaspora studies right now is that it's limited in two ways. The first way is that it begins in 1492, and the second is that it only directs itself to the west. So it doesn't look north and it doesn't look east, and part of what you're talking about is good. There are a couple of people who are writing on Indian Ocean relationships now, but I think that what you're thinking about in Turkey is quite fascinating. I mean, because the other thing it builds on is the question of what happens on the Silk Road. So,
and I have a student now who is going to be writing her dissertation. She's Iranian, and she's going to be writing her dissertation on the legacy of African slavery in Iran, and sort of, and how, and people, part of the problem is that the language for discussing this is very different, and often not encouraged, and often not something that's welcomed. Shuki Abhava has just published Black Morocco, which is all about sort of the diaspora in Morocco. So it's coming, but and I agree with that about African diaspora studies. I'm now a full member of the department, the brand new Department of Africana Studies at Penn, and we're actually trying to move east. So, yeah.
So Eve, can I ask you a very basic question?
Sure.
So in terms of how you do research, and I'm asking this for the benefit of my students sitting here who we've been engaging, especially in our capstone, how does one study from the point of view of an American, having lived sort of an American historical experience, difference in the histories of other people, particularly on this question of essentially race, right? So what is the language that one, as a Middle East historian, do you navigate and pioneer our own language, or can we find constructive paradigms that already exist through the histories of other societies? Are they useful?
Yes.
I mean, do we use the word race?
You're teaching a course, and I'm teaching a course.
I'm not teaching
this
specifically, but
okay.
your research raises this question, right? So
yeah.
what do we do?
tricky. And it's tricky, and it can seem very daunting. I have another talk that I've been giving, which is called Other People's Home, and How to Study Slavery in Cultures That Are Not Your Own. So I'm talking about slavery and race. And let's face it, I mean, in this culture as well, we think we're at ease talking about it. We think we have a language. But that language changes depending on the audience you speak to. That language changes on how you identify. That language changes on, what perspective you take on The Help, the movie, or Django, or depictions of slavery. I mean, seriously, we have a lot of trouble with it. So I think recognizing that we have a lot of trouble with it too is very important. But I have to say that I have been thoroughly humbled in doing my research in the Middle East with my assumptions of how to talk about race and how to talk about slavery. So when I first gave, many years ago, when I first gave a paper on my first book, which was about Egypt's relationship with Sudan, and sort of how Sudan figured so much into the Egyptian nationalist movement, I gave a talk, and a very prominent Egyptian historian, who was then the president of the American Mission Center in Egypt, who it turns out was related to one of the people I was talking about, which was unfortunate. She said to me, she listened to me as I was talking about sort of this, what's the patronizing idea of the unity of the Nile Valley. Okay, this guy meant it in a patronizing way. Not everybody did, but this guy did. And she looks me up and down, and then she gets it, and she says, well, you're just imposing who you are, and your sense of American race, and all this stuff. And she got mad, I got mad. No, it was my first paper. It was the first paper I ever gave, and no one would shut her up because she was the president, and stuff. And so that just made me mad. And I just felt like, wow, what she did to me, she just raced me because she looked at me and she looked at my name and she decided I couldn't be Egyptian, so I had no right to talk about this. And then it was as if she knew where I stood on issues of race. And I'm still trying to figure out where I stand in this stuff many years later. But she made assumptions, and I realized I had to be very careful because a lot of people were going to make those assumptions. And then when I was in Cairo, and this happened many times, maybe you have friends who experience this. I had a lot of friends who were from South Sudan, and as their political status began to deteriorate because of the civil war in Sudan, and as they were no longer able to be students in Cairo, but actually became refugees in Cairo. So as their clothes got less fancy, as they had to seek refuge in different churches, as they lost their jobs and they lost their homes, people would be called Abid, right? And I was with a very dear friend, and we were getting into a taxi together, and the taxi driver turned to me, thinking that I was Egyptian, and said, well, it smells like a slave in here. And he used the word Abid. And I couldn't even translate that word, because the only word I could think of that would translate is nigger. But it's not. It's different. But the sting is just as bad, right? But it's because it has that slavery part to it. And you don't hear Sudanese people joking with each other, yo, Abid, like the way we joke with, I guess I'm supposed to say the N-word now, okay? But so right there was like, how do you translate that word? And that's been one of my challenges, how to figure out what the impact of that word is. I think that being an American made me extra sensitive to it, but it made me differently sensitive to it. But I know that in Sudanese circles and among the Sudanese themselves, and the country split over a lot of this, the legacies of this word and enslavement are a big part of why we now have this new country of South Sudan. I'm learning to listen to different vocabularies about race and learning to honor it when people tell me I'm wrong, all right? Not just because of what I look like, but sometimes I do get it wrong. And I'll just end with getting it really wrong. The last chapter of this book is about a former slave whose name, who was sold and sold and sold. She was Sudanese. She ended up sold to the Italian consul in Sudan. She ends up going to Italy with him. She becomes a nun. her name is Josephine Bajita. She was beatified in 1992. She was canonized in the year 2000. She's a saint, and a very powerful saint, a very popular saint in Sudan, especially in South Sudan, but also in Egypt. And I was, again, in Cairo in 2004 at this point, interviewing refugees at the St. Bajita Center, all right, in Abbasiyah, and was there with a Coptic priest who was helping me because he was also working with refugees. And I just plunged into this discovery of these women, about their experience and all this stuff. This was all, in Arabic. And then I just started talking to him. So, what's your experience of slavery? If he could have kicked me under the table, he would have. And he shot me this look, and he had become my very dear mentor and everything. And I had never experienced this, and people just went cold on me. And after I talked to him, I had to go back to the St. Bajita Center and apologize to these women for insulting them by bringing up slavery. They heard it all the time. They didn't want to hear about it. It was, and that was where being an American was a detriment because, coming from, I'm from the generation in which, African American history, AFAM, was first taught. As an elementary school student, we were learning about Harriet Tubman and all this stuff. And so, I'm from a culture where there's no shame in it, right? Although, and for them, it wasn't over. It wasn't over. And I had no business. I had no right. So that's part of, it's a continuing process of figuring out when you're close enough to somebody to have these discussions.
I have two questions, one about your story and one set of questions that weren't in the version we got. When Iqbal, is your argument that when Iqbal arrives in Cairo that the precariousness of her status, she's not sent as a concubine, but that the precariousness of her status with the absent uncle makes her choose a lesser household arrangement than she might otherwise have? I mean, so that was just where your speculation goes, because I didn't know where you were heading on that.
Well, actually, she was supposed to go to one household, and the wife didn't want her.
I thought that,
So and then another household also kicked her out. So I just think she was sold.
You view that as a choice that she made to solidify her status? No. Oh, so you think that was involuntary?
I think he made it. I think his father made that choice.
Okay. And then, question: given by the 1880s, we have an attempt to impose British law around the status of slavery and the legal discourse of Britain as the police of Mediterranean slavery, versus within the Ottoman Empire where there's a different legal structure, a different legal language. How does that bear on both the legal discourse and naming of a personal status in the two places, and then in the different ways that the stories play out with the Lalas?
That's a great question. It really is. I don't know how much justice I can do to it, but the imposition of passports in the Nile Valley comes out of the Egyptian slave owners were trying to hide the identity of female slaves, and so they're saying that these slaves are their wives. And the British, with their manumission bureaus that they established after 1882, investigate those things. So certain kinds of papers have to come up for slaves to be able to travel, unless the British catch them. And this happens in the Ottoman Empire as well at the same time, when people try to move their slaves around. But notably, it's always African slaves, because other slaves are not as easily identifiable to European observers. And also, the pressure on Egypt from the British was so much greater because they were able to occupy. They never got that far with the Ottoman Empire. But it's a really, and Hakan Erdem writes a lot about this, and this slavery and abolition in the Ottoman Empire. The whole last chapter is about the Ottomans trying to figure out ways to get around all this language.
So what you're saying is even the legal ascriptive names could be deceptive in the sense that they're about how to categorize people so that they can be moved.
And just very quickly, I'll just say, and that's part of the problem in the way slavery is studied in Middle Eastern studies, because we often assume that it's the British who make all these attributions of racial difference in the slaves, and it's not. It's not.
Right, well, on behalf of the Center, Africana Studies, and Women and Gender Studies, we'd like to thank you for coming to